Our next panel will be discussing economics and education. Please welcome the panel's moderator from the Post and Courier, Brian Hicks. The panelists are Paula Boggs, former General Counsel for Starbucks, College of Charleston professor Godfrey Gibbison, former North Carolina State Senator and brother of the late Cynthia Graham Hurd, Malcom Graham, the Director of Government Affairs for Boeing, Mr. Lindsay Leonard, and also, once again, Reverend Nelson Rivers.
Everybody having fun out there? We can't see you. I'm the guy from the Post and Courier that you always read about on the Letters to the Editor page. We're talking about education and economics here, and we're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to tell you a quick story. In 1947, NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall came down and filed a lawsuit on behalf of some people in Clarendon County, South Carolina. The state had two separate school districts back then, a black and white. And the first problem that came up was that the black district had no school buses, the white district in that county had 33. Eventually, this lawsuit got expanded to take on the notion of segregation and ended up with the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. And everything was just fine after that. Right now, the state of South Carolina is in a lawsuit about adequate funding with a lot of poor, largely minority school districts across the state. This has been going on for 20 years, about a third of the time since Brown versus Board of Education. So we're going to talk about education and economics and how it relates to everything else. I want to start with Dr. Godfrey Gibbison, economics professor at College of Charleston. I have read that in Charleston County alone, by third grade, 84% of African American students are not reading at grade level. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found in your studies?
Right, so we have a tremendous amount of data that already shows the great disparities in educational achievement in Charleston County, but also in the Tri-County area. This is not just a problem in Charleston County. Right across the region, there are very significant gaps in achievement on almost any measure, whether it's test scores in reading, test scores in math, high school completion, readiness for college, completion of an associate degree or college degree. There are enormous gaps between African Americans, Hispanics, and whites. These are gaps that are persistent. They have been around for a long time. And the bigger problem is we have seen some gains in achievement over the last 5 years in those test scores. But what we're seeing is actually divergence rather than convergence. So even though the scores are getting better, African American scores are increasing at a much slower rate than the increase in scores among white counterparts. So I think I want to do one thing at the start and just acknowledge that we know that what happens to a child over the period of getting educated, some of it depends on their household, some of it depends on family, some of it depends on schools. We know this over 50 years of research. Let's just acknowledge that and put that out there. However, there's a significant role for the school system, and we know the school system has failed significantly in its portion of its job over the last 50 years, and that it's not getting much better, okay? And we also know that the most significant thing in terms of your economic prosperity, your economic outcome, education is the #1 factor. So if you start out behind and there is actually divergence as you get older, in other words, you're not catching up to the other kids as you get older in your educational outcome, which is how education works, right? Then you're starting out at an economic disadvantage, and that disadvantage is also going to diverge as you get older. It's not going to converge where you're going to catch up. You're always going to be at a disadvantage. And that is pretty much hard baked into into Charleston right now. If you look at across the population in terms of income or any other economic outcome, that disadvantage is very well hard baked in Charleston right now.
And that lasts all the way through. The other part of this is to get to the economics. I read that at graduation, only about 38% of white students from the Charleston County School District have the ACT Work Keys test scores to apply to work at a place like Boeing. But for African American students, it's less than 4%. Lindsay, from Boeing, what have you guys seen along those lines? I mean, do you have trouble getting a workforce in Charleston?
Yes, the reality is that to come to work at a place like Boeing in this facility, making this technologically advanced airplane, we have to have students coming out of high school who are college and career ready and meeting the grade level standards. And so it's certainly something that we look at and how we're going to be successful in this community for the next 50 to 100 years. We don't make this kind of an investment without looking at it to have generational impact. And so as a result of that, some of the numbers are incredibly staggering. 9 out of 10 African American students who come out of Charleston County School District have to retake remedial math. It's unacceptable from our perspective, and so where we look at how we make change is not just in our investments. We do not necessarily believe that more money equals better results or more efficiency. Sometimes we look for ways in which we can disrupt the status quo and how that can help lead to new solutions to problems that have persisted for a very long time. I mean, I think, it's impossible to be in Charleston County and not look at Academic Magnet and what was it, in 2015, 2016, admitted 1 African-American student and had less than 20. It is not possible for a reasonable, rational individual not to say that there is something inherent in the system that is affecting and discriminating against a certain set of students in some way.
And to just add that Academic Magnet was not always that way. So that was a decision, that was a deliberate decision that was taken to make a systematic change, a fundamental change that led to that outcome, right?
Mr. Graham, you've looked at education. You were on the city council in Charlotte. You were in the state legislature in North Carolina. What do you do about that? Because all of our state legislators tell me that the answer is not to throw money at the problem. And of course, they're saying that under the threat of this lawsuit, that they're not spending enough money. But what kind of experience have you had with this, and where do we even get to start the conversation on how to fix this?
My experience as a 6-year city council member, I served for 10 years in the North Carolina State Senate, and having conversations with my sister, Cynthia. And I think the key word that was just mentioned was systems. We have system failures throughout government. We have an educational system that still favors and predicts winners and losers by where people live. You live in the right neighborhood, you got a great school, you have a very active parent-teacher association, you have a booster club with plenty of money to support high school athletics, you have mature teachers who've been teaching the system for years. Or you live in the wrong zip code, you have new teachers, inadequate facilities, booster clubs that are not active, parent-teachers associations are not fully engaged, and the outcomes are predictable. We have a criminal justice system which equates to education and economics that picks winners and losers. Where if you're African American and you engage the system, many engage the system without adequate representation, they get criminal records. They get longer sentences for crack cocaine, as we talked about earlier, versus powder cocaine. It picks winners and losers. We have an employment system that if you are Sarah Johnson and you graduated from the College of Charleston with a 3.8 GPA, or if you're Shamika Johnson and you graduate from historically black South Carolina State University with that same GPA, your chances of getting employed would be better if your name was Shara than Shamika. We have a political system that creates artificial barriers, for an example, that prevents people of color and young people and other people from casting a vote for their council members or their school board members, or making it difficult to elect a candidate of their choices to make good decisions for them in terms of Medicaid expansion or healthcare decisions from a policy perspective. We have to own up to it and take a look at the man in the mirror and be able to say with conviction that we have system breakdowns through all of government, and that there is inherent racism or bias or discrimination that yields these results. And so we have to acknowledge that and then find the fortitude to find ways to fix it. Because if we don't, we will continue to have these conversations. The results will still be the same from the data. Boeing still will be trying to identify, get workers to work for them. But if the system is not producing the results, which is all men, black, white, rich, poor, should have a fair opportunity to reach the American dream, which is economic opportunity and economic success based on a quality education.
And this is a self-perpetuating cycle, because without the education, you can't reach economic prosperity, and that leads more often than not to crime, greater influence of that, impact of that. Paula? Yeah, you can't escape.
If you don't have a quality education, you can't get a job. If you don't have a quality education, you can't go to school to try to perform well if the child goes to school ill-prepared to succeed.
Paula, you were an assistant U.S. attorney, and I've been working recently a lot with recidivists, and one of the things that I'd never really considered was that crime is usually an economic problem. There are no other opportunities for people, and a lot of these guys that I've talked to have come out of prison that said, well, I stole or I did this because there wasn't any other way for me to make a living. Is that what you've seen, and is that part of this cycle as you've seen it?
Well, Brian, let me start by saying, and to the audience, I am not an educator, and I'm not a policymaker. And so at first I scratched my head. Why am I on this panel? But before I get to your question, there are a couple of things I've just heard that I think I can add a slightly different but affirming perspective to. I'm not from this community. I'm from Seattle. But the problems I've just heard described are certainly not unique to Charleston. They're not unique to the South. Many of the issues that we're talking about are Seattle's issues too. There is huge economic disparity in Seattle, and it is increasing on a daily basis, the chasm between the haves and the have-nots. And The education piece of the equation is absolutely critical. I live in a school district, the Lake Washington School District, which is one of the most affluent in the United States. Regardless of race, your likelihood of graduating from a Lake Washington school, if you live there, is exceedingly high. If you're in the Seattle school district, public school district, which is only 20 miles from Lake Washington, the equation is radically different. I did serve as a federal prosecutor in one of my past lives. I'm now a musician. And as a federal prosecutor in Seattle, I often marveled at the incredible intelligence of the criminals I prosecuted, and posed that internal question: where would this person be but for a mistake, really? Could this person have been a lawyer, which is what I was? I think so. Could this person have been an engineer? Certainly the skills brought to bear in perpetrating this crime would suggest that this person is outstanding in math, is outstanding in a variety of things that put towards a different use might have seen a different life journey for that individual. And so, you know, from a prosecutor standpoint, many of us in Seattle started asking the question, are there things we individually can do? And that's a very personal question, but for some of us, it led to mentoring. I think, you know, an earlier panel was a law enforcement panel. And, you know, part of the energy of the discussion, and I thought it was a great discussion, comes from the different prisms through which people see the same set of facts, right? And what mentoring did for me personally was it helped me develop empathy for a young person whose socioeconomic situation might be far different than mine. And with that, wasn't just me giving to that young person, I was receiving a lot in that process. And it made me, it actually made me a better prosecutor in the sense of, with prosecutorial discretion, I could make better decisions on whether to charge somebody in the first place.
I think that's a very interesting point, particularly about some of the people you ran across and wondered if they could have been an attorney if they'd started at a different place. I'm reminded, I don't know what it is, but I keep hearing this reference a lot in the past, I don't know, since January 20th, about somebody being born on third base and thinking they've hit a triple. And that seems to be one of our problems here. And Reverend, you were telling me about something that you had found that just shows you how far back this problem goes. So would you?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm going to read the state law that was passed in 1834, became law April 1, 1835. Be it enacted by the Honorable the Senate and House of Representatives, now met and sitting in General Assembly and by the authority of the same, if any person shall hereafter teach any slave to read or write, or cause or procure any slave to read or write, such person, if a free white person, upon conviction thereof, shall, for each and every offense against this act, be fined not exceeding $100, and imprisoned not more than 6 months. Or if a free person of color shall be whipped not exceeding 50 lashes and fined not exceeding $50 at the discretion of the court of magistrates and freeholders before which such person of color is tried. And if a slave, to be whipped at the discretion of the court, not exceeding 50 lashes, the informant to be entitled to 1/2 of the fine and to be a competent witness. And if any free person of color or slave shall keep any school or other place of instruction for teaching any slave or free person of color to read or write, such free person of color or slave shall be liable to the same fine, imprisonment, and corporal punishment as are by this act imposed and inflicted upon free persons of color and slaves for teaching slaves to read or write. What I said to Brian in my email in response to him was that policy is not what you write, policy is what you do. South Carolina has had a policy from at least 1835 to intentionally not educate black children at the same level as other children, particularly white children, and the policy also made it a criminal offense to learn to read or write, and made it a criminal offense to teach someone of color to read or write, and it made it a criminal offense to own a school. This law made Daniel Payne leave Charleston in 1835 because the school he had, I would say one of the first black charter schools, the school he had was outlawed because it was teaching black people to do something that the Confederacy and the state of South Carolina did not want them to do, which was teach black folk to read. This is my point. The only people that had a law passed that made it illegal to learn to read or write was black people in South Carolina. What does that mean? Everyone else had a head start, no matter how you dress it up. But the other thing it meant was when I read or taught somebody to read, I was committing a crime. That means that even the white slave owners who wanted to teach their slaves to read for whatever reason were also committing a crime. So fast forward, I said this to the superintendent, that I believe that this policy is still in effect. The law changed, but the policy did not. Because the policy is not about what the law says, the policy is what the intent was in the first place. And the intent was to make sure that black children would never have the same kind of education as white children. Now, Academic Magnet is closer to my church than North Charleston High School. So this is not just a zip code issue. This is not just a geography issue. This is a policy issue. Because you have folk riding 20 miles to go to Academic Magnet, and they built a fence between Liberty Hill and Academic Magnet so the black children who live next door to Academic Magnet cannot go to school. So don't think this is just about some trouble folk are having, some household problems. No, let's get real. The fact of the matter is the day that South Carolina decides by doing it in policy that's enacted, that all children must be educated, but particularly the ones who were intentionally left out, that's when you'll see the change. This is just window dressing. We're just dancing with the issue. The economic part of it is this. How do I make sure that the folk who gave me free labor are kept as close to that condition as possible? So I have to make sure, one, they don't get educated at the same level as other children that I prefer, and I have to also make sure that I use that against them to keep them going to Leeds Avenue as opposed to where your place is over by the airport. So how does that play out? We have to, on the one hand, work hard against this inherent issue of discrimination and racism that affects our children even right now, because you cannot, even if you gamble, you cannot get the kind of numbers she just talked about. Academic Magnet, 600 or maybe more, 800 students, 1,200 students. There are 5 black students. There are 10 at the most. Now, I'll take them odds if it was money, that you can't tell me that somebody didn't put their finger on the weight scale to get this done. You cannot accidentally produce a system where 1,200 students and black folk make up 40% plus of all the student population of Charleston County. You got a public school in Charleston that has less than 1% to 2% of the students are black, and people look at me and say, well, there must be something wrong with the children. No, there's nothing wrong with the fish. The water is jacked up. You need to fix the water.
Well, let me throw this out there to all of you and just chime in as you want. how do you fix this? How do you go ahead? I mean, I hear arguments from mainly from people who don't want to spend money, who say that throwing money is not the solution. And, you know, there's some evidence for that. You look at Charleston County, they spend a lot more per pupil than some other districts in the state, and they don't have any better results. But what do you do? Where do you start?
So let's start by saying we have to acknowledge and agree that we have a public policy problem. It's a public problem, it's a social problem, and that the society cares, right? So here's what I mean. We've talked about the numbers that we're seeing. These numbers have not been new, they've been going on for 50 years. And everybody, when we say these numbers, people in the city seem to be surprised. Well, and I have to ask, how the hell did you not know? Like, how could you not know these things? How could you not just look around and observe that this was happening right under your noses, right? So people are always shocked that there are some people in Charleston who live in poverty. Really? I mean, how could you not see it? So you have to agree that this is a public policy problem, it's a social problem, and that we're going to fix it as a society. In other words, let's get away from this notion that it's all about personal responsibility. I know this is not the best line, but let's get away from from personal responsibility and agree that the society cares about this problem and will do something about the problem. I mean, I admire folks who are mentors and folks but you can't solve the problem of reading by having 70-year-olds going to school to teach kids to read. That's just not how it works. The system has to lead to outcomes. Now, I'll give you a practical suggestion. The Supreme Court says that we have failed by perpetuating a system of minimally adequate schooling. By the way, that is embarrassing. And I tell this story all over the country, that South Carolina was satisfied with giving its kids minimally adequate public schooling. Now listen to those words, minimally adequate public schooling. We all accepted that. We all said that was okay. None of us marched up to Columbia and said that was not okay, okay? So part of it is just us. We have not demanded better, right?
Well, some of us did march up to Columbia.
Minimally, Reverend did march up to Columbia. Minimally adequate schooling, right? We need to understand, what works. Other states have solved these problems. I mean, I know this is a national issue, but other cities have found solutions. We have not been willing to go and ask them, how have you done this? Nashville has shown tremendous success in this. And another great southern city has shown tremendous success in the last 15 years. We can go ask the people in Nashville, but the state needs to go ask the people in Nashville or the city of Charleston, how did you solve these problems? How did you have better outcomes? And how could we use those outcomes here in our
One
city?
solution is the Charleston Forum is a great idea, although I had a lot of doubts when I got started and have not resolved all of them yet. But I do know this one thing, that this is a majority white male organization. If this is going to change, white males in power must decide if this is acceptable. When it's not, they'll help change it. As long as it is acceptable, it won't change. You can dance with that and dress it up all you want. The bottom line is the people in power, both economic power, political power, and even the power of deciding who goes where. When they decide this is unacceptable, and maybe it took Clemente's death and the 8, maybe it took this kind of spotlight, I am not sure. But I am real confident of one thing, and I said this to some of my friends who got me involved with a lot of this justice work that's so important, that until you are able to engage white male leadership in power in Charleston, it won't happen, because this is not an accidental thing. This is an intentional outcome that is being designed. The system works the way it's designed to work. When you want a different outcome, we'll have a different design. That hasn't happened yet because not enough folk in the privilege and power position have decided this is unacceptable. So that leaves folk like us who have to do this work day in and out, confront argue, work, and push, it takes longer to get where we're going if we have to fight this situation and you too. So what will happen is that for my church, we finally got sick of dealing with this situation, so we've created something called the Liberty Hill Transformation, because Boeing told us in a meeting that they can't hire our young people because they don't have STEM education. And I looked at it, we don't have a STEM program in my community, and I'm next door to a doggone school that won't let my children in because of what they look like. So I can either get mad, which I've done a lot, or I can get mad and glad enough to do something about it. So I got mad and went to work. And so we have now reached an agreement where there'll be a STEM education in the track that's affecting Liberty Hill School. What does that mean? They don't have to wait for 5 years or 10 years, that next year in the Morningside Middle School and the North Charleston Elementary School, the North Charleston High School, we will start to have STEM education that Boeing will invest, not with my church and not with me, because I don't need your money. All I need you to do is get right to help me do what I got to do. That if you will invest your money in the first grade, in the 20-month-old, in the 3-year-old, and realizing that if you're in business 50 more years, it's not at the end of the 50 you wake up and say we didn't do something right. Invest now, because what we have a chance to do is quit arguing about the obvious and do something about it. Unfortunately, we're fighting almost like one-armed paper hangers because the folk who can help the most are doing the least.
Well, Reverend Rivers and I have talked a lot. He's helped us and shaped the way that we see doing business in a new place. Since I'm the representative, I guess, for the person in some amount of power who can affect certain things in the city, state, and in our community, I will answer the question in two different ways. I will say what I do in my day-to-day, in my job. I'm asked all the time what we are going to do about education. I'm asked what we're going to do about everything in the state, from climate change to domestic abuse to every other social problem, and I don't have those answers. I'm sorry to tell you. But what I do know to do is to work with people and partner with people. Reverend Rivers actually introduced us, what was it, a couple years ago now, to Liberty Hill. You know, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you raise your individual level of consciousness, that's how I believe we can affect change. I believe I can change myself. And so I do the best I can every day to show up and look at what I can impact. What I can impact is the number of students that we reach, the dollars that we spend, the policies that are enacted. And so we stepped up we probably haven't stepped up in every way that everybody would like us to step up. We're still learning. I'm in Boeing, and in 3 years, give me a little more time, and we'll see how much more we can chip away. But we have really taken the call seriously. As Paula said, the social issues of today are some of the same social issues of 50 years ago and 100 years ago. In different ways, in different areas of the country. But for us, we've taken a really multifaceted and holistic approach. We do not simply invest in a STEM or STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. We don't invest in a given program. We require evidence-based outcomes, results. As Reverend Rivers was talking about, one thing that we're really excited about and have seen tremendous results with in South Carolina is a curriculum called Project Lead the Way for engineering. And the trick is to get it pulled down through the system. I mean, so high schools had it. Now we get it into middle schools, then we go into the elementary schools, then we go into the 0 to 5, because I don't think that people realize how important that is. A child's brain architecture, roughly 85% of it is developed by 3 to 5, depending on which science you're looking at. And most people don't know what the impacts are. I will say that it causes us all to ask a lot of the really hard internal questions, and that's true for the executives at Boeing. Reverend Rivers knows my boss, Tim Keating. Many people in the area know him. He's on Boeing's executive council. He's worked for President Clinton. And, we've all been faced with questions that we, maybe didn't know we needed to ask ourselves. And so under his leadership, we've done a lot of innovative things down here. One of which, you know, there's a split opinion in the community about Meeting Street at Brentwood. Meeting Street at Brentwood it's a public-private partnership. It's not a charter school. It educates children in the neighborhood region. It costs, on average, about $13,500 to educate a child there. Now, Charleston County School District is spending, on average, if you take out the other programming, $10,500 to educate a child. Mary Ford is somewhere in the range of $11,000. Sullivan's Island, $12,400. Anybody who's been to Mary Ford or Sullivan's Island and has the gift of sight knows the difference in those two schools. But what happens with a school like Meeting Street is that extra $3,000. I mean, $3,000. This is money that doesn't need to be added. It just needs to be efficiently reallocated. It starts at 3 years old. It's all meals. It's longer days, longer years. They have 100% parent involvement in report card conferences. So for the factions that say it's parent involvement, you know, if the kids were getting their parents involved, then maybe they would be better off. You know, all of that is tinged with the idea that it's still a problem that's out there versus something that we all have to look at individually. And to your point, I'm not talking about personal responsibility. I'm not saying, okay, the problem is personal responsibility and everybody should take it. I'm saying that I feel like I have to take personal responsibility for the larger problem. Everybody in here would probably say that they support high quality education for all children. The question becomes, what does that actually mean? Because a lot of parents will say, yes, I support high quality education for all children, only if it doesn't mean that another child gets that spot at academic magnet over mine. And so what happens is, you know, or that principal doesn't get transferred because I want him at my school. And so that's where the tough questions come in, and that's where, you know, we all have to take the responsibility for what the system is and how to better affect it, to make it work for more people, more children.
You look like you've got something to say, Mr. Graham.
Well, no, I think Mr. Rivers said it all. And you got to acknowledge that the problems exist, and then you have to speak truth to power. And it's, as I said earlier, it's a systematic issue, and people that have the power and control have to acknowledge that the problem exists, and they have the resources within this community to get it done. I know Mr. Rivers more by reputation, and I know he's been out there fighting for equality and social issues for many, many years. He needs soldiers. He needs people fighting and working and walking with him. And he doesn't need just African Americans. He needs people that work on Broad Street and live in Sullivan's Island and care about this community to fight this fight with them. Because if not, again, we're having this polite conversation, but the issue, and it is hard, and you know, who would have thought that a white man would go into an African American church and kill 9 folks? That is racism. And racism, and that's an outlier thing that happened, I understand it, but racism and discrimination and bias occurs in systems every day. You know, African Americans and people of color are being killed by systems every day. So we can't just react when something out of the ordinary happens. Racism, my sister got killed along with 8 others. She would say that that was an attack on a race of people. It was an attack on humanity. It was an attack on the Christian church. But people are being attacked every day by these broken systems, and unless people in power, and I'm born and raised in Charleston, and I love the Battery, and I love that you guys got cruise ships here, and I love that we're going to build the African American Museum. Those things are nice, but they don't solve system problems. Let's work on fixing the broken systems and doing something that's very hard. Take a look at the man in the mirror and critique what you see.
Well, thank you. We are running out of time. I think the key takeaway here is you have to get the people in power to acknowledge there's a problem. And, you know, I was looking on Facebook just this morning. They can't even acknowledge that slavery played a role in the Civil War. So getting them to acknowledge this is going to be a hard thing. But keep preaching it. Thank you all for having us. And I guess that's it.